Hi, and thank you all for joining us. I'm Yasmin Vafa. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Rights for Girls. We are a US-based human rights organization working to defend the rights of vulnerable girls here in the United States. We are so excited to be hosting today's discussion in collaboration with the Skoll Foundation on a issue that is of central importance to our work and our advocacy. I want to thank our participants for joining. Please feel free to input any questions that you have directly in the chat box. We will do our best to answer some of those questions towards the end of our time together. Today, we're honored to be joined by several women leaders who will provide invaluable insight on issues related to matters of racial justice, gender equality, and the movement to end gender-based violence. This conversation is happening against not just the national, but international recognition around the harms and impact of things like white supremacy and colonialism, against the backdrop of a cultural reckoning around the impact and scope of gendered and patriarchal violence. Here in the United States, there has been much momentum around the need for racial justice, meaningful criminal justice reform, addressing things like mass incarceration and reimagining safety, along with institutions like our police system. We are also witnessing some of the really brave and courageous testimonies that have come from women and survivors that have been demanding safety, dignity, and justice for victims of gender-based violence through efforts like the Me Too movement. But I think rarely has there been an opportunity and really an appreciation for the ways in which these movements intersect and overlap, and certainly how they manifest in the daily lives of young women and girls. And so we are really grateful to have that space to explore some of these issues and intersections. It's particularly important that we are coming here on what is Sexual Assault Awareness Month because, as we'll come to discuss, sexual assault is actually a key driver for criminal justice involvement in girls of color. Girls like Tanya, who at age 4 was placed into foster care and over the last 10 years has endured multiple placements where she has experienced abuse at the hands of not just caretakers, but other youth and staff in the facilities in which she's been placed. Frustrated by her social workers' inability to interact and intervene in the abuse she's suffering, as well as frustration at the system's inability to keep her safe, Tanya decided to take her safety into her own hands. And so she ran away to escape the abuse that she was suffering in her foster care placement. But in doing so, she was arrested for the status offense of running away. There are girls like Sarah, who at age 13 met a 28-year-old trafficker online, who, after a period of weeks of showing her love and affection, then demanded that she start sleeping with other men for money in order to support them. When she was found at a hotel with 2 adult men, it was Sarah who was arrested for prostitution, despite not being old enough to consent, and despite the fact that laws recognize girls like Sarah as victims of human trafficking. And so this is the abuse to prison pipeline. This is what we're here to discuss. Girls like Sarah and Tanya and thousands of others like them throughout the US, who experience gender-based violence, but whose faces are invisible and who remain nameless and who are really not contemplated in any of these conversations that we are having around racial justice, criminal justice reform, or gender-based violence. And so girls like Sarah and Tanya need to be contemplated and need to be centered in these discussions, because what we're realizing is that they suffer violence at disproportionate rates. And so we know that girls of color, including Black, Latina, and Indigenous girls, suffer violence at rates much higher than their white counterparts. And when we started talking to girls across the country who had experienced juvenile justice involvement, we were really startled by the fact that so many of them shared these common narratives of experiencing child abuse and family violence in their homes. And so we decided to pull the data. And when we did, we saw that almost everywhere we looked, girls had experienced prior victimization before entering the system. And so when we took these high rates of trauma and looked at them together with the most common offenses for girls, it became very, very clear that they were actually being criminalized for their victimization. And so nationally, some of the more common offenses for girls were things like running away from home, truancy or skipping school, prostitution offenses, as well as substance abuse and dependency. And so all of those should be signs and evidence of dealing with or trying to escape situations of trauma. It should be no surprise that girls of color are disproportionately victimized by the abuse to prison pipeline. And so through research that we've done, we've primarily focused on Black, Indigenous, and Latina girls who are overrepresented at basically every single stage in the process. And so when we talk about issues of justice reform and gendered violence and racial justice, we just have to make sure that we aren't leaving our girls behind. Because I think one of the most devastating realities that we've encountered is that girls are keenly aware of the ways in which they're suffering. Girls are very aware of the ways in which systems and adults entrusted with their care perceive them, that they're not seen as victims of crime, as survivors of abuse. In many cases, they're robbed of their childhood and innocence and they're not even seen as children. And so I think it's really critical to hold all of this information and these realities as well as the data when we're talking about these issues. And so today, we don't just want to talk about what is causing the abuse to prison pipeline, we also want to talk about the solutions to end it. And so we're really honored to have with us today Melanie, Kara, and Maheen. I want to give each of our speakers an opportunity to first introduce themselves and then tell you a little bit more about their work before launching into our question session. So Kara, do you mind starting us off?
Hey, thanks for the honor. Thank you so much. Here all the way from Hawaii. I'm the executive director of the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women, which is the first feminist state-level government agency in the United States. I serve as kind of the main policy consultant to all of our elected officials at the county, city, and also state and CODEL level. And we're also kind of the research center and hub for women and girls and gender nonconforming people. A little bit about me. I think I have like 1 more minute, but what I think is important to share right now, my background, I'm a recovering lawyer. My background, what's worse than being a bureaucrat, right? My background is as an immigrant rights organizer. That's how I started off. And it's really because my family is from the Philippines, and we were caught in the middle of, imperialist foreign policy and racist immigration policy. So that really defined my professional and organizing trajectory. I think that when we talk about gender justice and racial justice in the context of girlhood, there's a very Western American framing. It's like, are you promoting individualism and agency, or are you being paternalistic and disempowering? And that doesn't resonate with me as a Filipino. In my culture, we have a lifelong responsibility to guide, nurture, and protect anyone younger than us. And it's reciprocal. And so we also have, this cultural value at our core that's called kapwa, and it's interconnectedness. And it basically is inconsistent with exploitative interactions and relationships. And so that's kind of the frame that I'm bringing today. I don't normally out myself as a survivor. I will say that I have been through the gauntlet of American girlhood and sustained, long-standing wounds, but also long-lasting wisdoms as a result. So also shout out to all the parents on here during COVID. That's the thing too. I'm a mom of a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. Thanks.
Thank you, Kara. Mel, would you like to go next?
Sure. Kara just has me smiling from everything that she was saying just now. But hi, everybody. Also, thank you guys for having me. My name is Melanie Thompson. I am a lived experience expert of the sex trade. I am also the youth outreach coordinator at the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, which is an international organization, one of the oldest and first international organizations to combat violence against women and girls. I've been doing advocacy work for about 10 years. I think this is year 11 as of next week. And this is just something ever since I've left the sex trade and ended up in multiple systems. This was something that I really just clung to the minute that I figured out that my voice was valuable in even the smallest sense. And there's so many of my brothers, sisters, older women mentors, so many of us that were in the sex trade that didn't make it out. And I think that there is something to be said for those of us who still stand here today, hence why I do this work. So the perspective that I bring to you today is not only that of somebody who has survived the sex trade, but also as somebody who has navigated and gone through the court system, grew up in foster care, and am now sitting here as somebody in their mid-20s doing this work. So I'm looking forward to our discussion today, and thank you guys for all being here.
So much, Mel. Maheen.
Sure. I hate following Melanie always, but I'm so excited to be here with so many amazing sisters in the work. I'm Maheen Kaleem. I'm the Deputy Director of an organization called Grantmakers for Girls of Color, which works to amplify and mobilize resources to support transformative organizing work that is led by girls and gender expansive youth of color in the US. So I think the only other relevant background is I have had the great honor of serving as a staff attorney at Rights for Girls in my earlier days and helping to co-author the Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline report, and also as a program officer at the Novo Foundation, where I managed their work to end commercial sexual exploitation. So I come from sort of a little bit of I like to identify myself as a movement lawyer, although I don't formally practice law anymore, and get to sit in the philanthropic spaces that many of you sit in to support the organizing work that is happening on the ground and in the advocacy work that people like Cara, Melanie, and Yasmin are leading. And also as someone who received their political education and my political awakening from girls in juvenile halls is really where I learned everything that I know now about my own girlhood and understanding my own situation as a first generation Pakistani American, and also as a survivor of gender-based violence and an advocate on behalf of girls, women, and gender expansive folks who have experienced violence.
So much. Again, it's such a privilege to have all of you joining us and sharing your wisdom on a topic that I know is deeply personal to all of us. And I think, as all of us kind of have embarked on our work and our advocacy journeys, I think it brings up a lot about our own experiences. So I can absolutely relate to much that was just said and shared. I think first, I'd love to just hear from each of you a little bit about what the Abuse to Prison Pipeline looks to you in your work or where you're situated in the country. And if you can each just take a moment to share a little bit about that, starting with you, Mel.
Yeah, so it's very similar. I'm based in New York, so it's very similar to what you were mentioning earlier. Me as a survivor of sex trafficking, I can speak personally to seeing how that plays out when somebody, in my case, I came from a domestic violence household, so I already had that prior abuse history in the household. Then I don't want to use the word transferred, but then transitioning into the sex trade where I had a trafficker go kidnap me and put me into a lifestyle like such, and then still end up at the age of 13 getting arrested on prostitution charges when, like you mentioned, I'm not old enough to consent. So just to see how our country really treats people that are marginalized and treats us that are the victims in this particular sense and the ones that come from the violence and the abuse, seeing how we transition to be the criminals is really not only baffling, but very frustrating. And it's even outside, at least in the work that I've seen and in the work that I've done, it's even more than just sex trafficking. We see this with a rape victim or anybody who has gone through some type of sexual abuse or assault. And instead of the person that is raping or abusing be criminalized or be held accountable, it's the woman who gets asked all of the questions on her outfit, what she was doing, why was she out so late. So we see how it's not only very upsetting, but it also happens very quickly. And we see that transition from being a 12-year-old person in this world to being a 13-year-old criminal. So I can definitely attest to that firsthand on how I guess disgusting it really is.
Thank you. Cara, would you like to share next?
Yeah, so about Hawaii, probably everyone has been exposed to the image of Hawaii, that idyllic place where you go to leave your cares behind. But beneath that is one of the toughest economies in the United States to survive. And it's also a US colony. So in Hawaii, the last time I went to the Hawaii Youth Correctional Facility, the children's prison essentially here, 100% of the girls there were victims of sex trafficking, according, by federal law definition, and 100% were either Native Hawaiian or Black girls. And this is really, from my perspective in government, the sexual abuse or abuse to prison pipeline is a method of exterminate all the brutes, to borrow from Raul's HBO special out right now. Because Native Hawaiians and also the local population is really a permanent underclass, second to the needs of tourists and military. Basically, our government is obsessed with managing and attracting tourists and military projects here. So anything seen as a threat to that, which would be, ruining or tarnishing the image of Hawaii, talking about sexualization as a problem, talking about what the levels of violence here, is very threatening. I had a conversation last year. This is kind of like the background of why we just do criminalization as the answer. But I had a conversation last year during right before COVID, with the director of the Department of Transportation, and talking about, let's do this campaign, an awareness campaign related to commercial sexual exploitation. And the answer was, we can't do that, Cara, because we'll scare off tourists. And then the next thing you know, we'll all be trafficking each other, quote unquote. So there really is an overt resistance to tackling the upstream factors that play into the criminalization of girls. I will say positively, in 2004, we did this, our family court system and our legal system decided to interrupt the pipeline by establishing a gender responsive court called Girls Court, which has led to really dramatic improvements in the lives of girls. And it's also based in Native Hawaiian cultural values. So I'll stop there, but that's kind of a snapshot of what we have in Hawaii that mirrors what's going on nationally.
Thank you. I think that was incredibly helpful and just like a perfect example of the ways in which, the safety and dignity of girls of color is really just devalued, right? And just subordinated to everyone else's needs. That's pretty horrific. Maheen, do you want to share a little bit as well?
Sure. And thank you, Cara, for also lifting up Native Hawaiian and Indigenous girls in this conversation, because when we talk about girls of color, I think particularly in philanthropic spaces, the question is always, who do we mean? And we mean many different communities of young people who don't identify as white, but identify as many, many other things. And to Cara's point about understanding the particular cultural and historical context of those communities is really important in interrupting the pipeline, and I know we'll talk about that. But in answering this question, I kind of want to speak first as like my role as a former service provider and sister and advocate to many survivors of the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, and then as someone who sits in philanthropy now. So what it looks like from a very personal perspective is, I started working with young people who were impacted by commercial sexual exploitation in like 2007. And at that point, the laws weren't even necessarily recognizing them as survivors of sex trafficking. And a lot of those young people did end up with not only records in the juvenile justice system, but when the juvenile justice system wasn't appropriately responding to them, they were just exited out. And what happened was a lot of them ended up either continuing to be trafficked or entering domestic violence situations. And because of the frameworks of the laws around gender-based violence and other forms of gender-based violence that they continued to experience, they went into adulthood, ended up in the adult criminal justice system, and are now walking around in their young adulthood with warrants, which make it harder for them to exit situations of exploitation and violence because of the sexual abuse that they experienced that led them into the criminal justice system. So I just wanted to give that's what it looks like in my personal life, is people who are continuing to live through this well into their adulthood. And without the compassion of being children, right? That at least when you're a child, some people might have some compassion or understanding for you. All of that goes away when you turn 18. And then what it looks like in the funder space is actually a vast underinvestment in all of the strategies that could interrupt the pipeline, because you have a small set of funders, shout out to Just Beginnings Collaborative and others who are looking to address child sexual abuse, but not always with a racial or gender justice lens. Then you have funders who are focused on racial justice. And I will tell you that organizations like Rights for Girls will go to a racial justice funder, and often, and I've seen it, that funder will say, talk to our women's rights program. And then they'll go to the women's rights program, and the women's rights program will say, talk to our racial justice program. So the lack of intersectional framing, actually what that means is that none of those strategies get invested in. And specifically what that looks like in the policy landscape, and Yasmin can speak much more specifically to this, is when you for many, many years, a lot of the juvenile justice, criminal justice, justice funders, if people were talking about criminal justice and racial justice, were saying, well, there are not enough girls in the juvenile justice system to warrant funding or any robust response. And what happened is 20 years later, as the Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline report so clearly outlines, the population of girls in the juvenile justice system has increased by at least 40% at all points of entry. So what ends up happening then is that because nobody paid attention, and because the justification was there are not enough girls, is that now we have an overrepresentation, and unsurprisingly, an overrepresentation of girls and gender expansive youth of color in the juvenile justice and in the adult criminal legal system. So I think that's important to name in the philanthropy space. What it looks like is the lack of understanding of the sexual abuse to prison pipeline in general means that we are failing to invest in the strategies that could actually ensure all of the things that we care about, whether it's racial justice or women's and gender rights that relate to and addressing and strategies to address gender-based violence.
No, I think that's incredibly helpful. We witnessed this firsthand, and there's so many ways in which this lack of intersectional framing just harms girls of color in so many different ways, right? And we saw this in DC. DC was really patting itself on the back, thought they had enacted some really amazing and expansive juvenile justice reform. And through our relationships with a lot of the juvenile defenders, we kept getting contacted about, why are we seeing so many girls in our caseload? We don't understand. We just enacted this amazing bill, like the arrest rates for boys are going down, youth incarceration is going down, what's going on? And so when we looked at the data and we disaggregated by things like race and gender, which are still inadequate, right? We need to be looking at many more identifiers and categories. We found that girls of color and in DC specifically, Black girls were not benefiting. And in many cases, they were worse off. So, we found, for example, during a 10-year period where boys' arrest rates were falling, girls' arrest rates were increasing by 87%, right? And they were getting arrested at younger and younger ages. And again, very indicative of abuse to prison pipeline. And so that intersectional framing, I think, is so important to actually having meaningful policies. And we've seen that day in and day out. So thank you, all of you, for sharing that. I think it's also important to kind of look at and examine how it is that we even got to this point. I think, we're all clear that these systems and these issues didn't appear overnight. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about some of the larger and historic systems of oppression and how they impact the lives of girls of color. And this is for anyone. I mean, Kara, if you don't mind, maybe you kind of alluded to some of these issues being from Hawaii.
Hey, so, Native Hawaiian girls report highest levels of sadness and hopelessness. It's like 47 or almost 50%. And they also, one in 4 Native Hawaiian girls high school girls have seriously attempted suicide. And it's the highest rates out of any other group. And what's the root cause of this? The root cause is really the way that, women's status was torn down through a really intentional process. And, we talk about intersectionality, and we also like to talk about the idea of confluence, that, this prison, policing, prostitution as an industry, and more are not separate systems that are colliding, but actually part of the same package of patriarchy that was introduced through Western colonization. And so, even within my parents' lifetime, Hawaii was categorized by the United Nations as a non-self-governing territory. So it was only very recently colonized, and things like incarceration were not a system here relatively recently. And so all of this onslaught of foreign systems based on totally different values really weigh the heaviest on Indigenous girls here and girls of color. So I really trace it back to that history, which is not confined to the past, but is actually an ongoing process in Hawaii.
Thank you. Anyone else want to share?
I think the only other things I would add are, one is, there is a long standing and very specific history around the enslavement and commodification, particularly of Black and Indigenous girls in the US and around the world. And that is a project that was actually created as a way to continue to subjugate. And often what we see, whether in a lot of forms of conflict, is that the way that patriarchy exercises itself physically is in control over women and girls' bodies. And so you can't really talk about the sort of policing that now exists and the surveillance that exists over girls of color's bodies if you don't understand the historical and very intentional policy framework that was put in place in order to exact that control. And a lot of if you look at sort of the initial girls' schools in the 1800s that were created, they were created for the destitute, the dependent, and the delinquent. And if you look at what that means and who's actually in the juvenile justice system now, it is girls who come from working class or impoverished backgrounds. It is girls of color, predominantly because they come from those communities when Clara talks about confluence. It is girls in the child welfare system, so dependency systems, right? And delinquency systems. So if you think about, that's the language that was being used in the 1800s, and that's the language that continues to be used now, then it's hard to extricate them as two different things. But instead, a very, I think, intentional project to continue to regulate and control women's bodies. And there are a lot of people that talk about this really explicitly. The other thing that I think is important to name, and I see in the chat people lifting up the work of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the movement to sort of raise awareness around that. I was speaking to a woman who was telling me that a survivor, an Indigenous survivor, who told me that in Cheyenne, there is no word for prostitution or quote unquote prostitute, that actually that was a word that colonization brought. And that was a system that colonization brought. And so I think, like to Kara's point, you can't talk about this without talking about enslavement through the transatlantic slave trade and the fancy girl trade that existed. And you can't talk about where we're at without understanding the way that colonization continues to play out in our communities. But I could get to know.
No, I think that's incredibly powerful. And I think, some of the things that we try to do is to call out, these systems of oppression, right? And there's been a lot of conversation around abolition, right? Abolishing these violent, racist, oppressive systems. And there's been a lot of focus on things like prisons, right? And policing, because they stem directly from the slave trade, right? Because they disproportionately impact people of color and predominantly, Black folks. And so it's interesting the ways in which this commercial sex trade sometimes escapes that same analysis when it too has roots in colonization, in the slave trade, and was used as a means to subjugate, control, and dehumanize women of color, particularly Black and Indigenous women. So when we talk about, systems of oppression, we really have to open our minds and really examine them all. This next question is for you, Melanie. What do you wish that more people understood about our current system, from policing to kind of the whole criminal justice apparatus, and the ways in which it responds to children of color in particular? Is there something that you wish people understood better about how it functions?
The main thing is that it doesn't work. I would want people to understand that. But really what you just said, I feel like, in this time where everybody wants to be progressive or woke or wants to focus on all these different social justice issues, everybody loves to throw around the term intersectionality. And for valid reason, as you should. We need to have an intersectional approach and an intersectional lens when we talk about any form of gender-based violence, especially when it's on the premise of race. But what I want people to understand is that many of our current, what I call the injustice systems, they don't have that intersectional lens. And if you don't understand the intersectionality between race, between capitalism, between patriarchy and misogyny, specifically when it comes to sexual violence, you're not going to understand why our system isn't working. And for many people, hearing even just earlier your statistic on the rate that Black girls are incarcerated, for many, that's a shock. And that the reason it comes as a shock is because people are not understanding this from an intersectional lens. But for people like myself, people like every one of us on this call that do this work, for people who have that intersectional approach, they understand that because our police system, like you mentioned, is built on and is based on chattel slavery, because our criminal justice system is still predominantly white male judges that are still usually prosecuting Black, brown, and indigenous folks, because we have these historical racial oppressions sitting in the crux of all of our justice system, nothing is going to change. A lot of people now, as we talk about police reform or versus police abolition and all these conversations, a lot of people think that the idea is that they can just take out a few bad apples and the police system is going to change and Black killings are going to cease and, you know, there's going to be a lot more fairness in the justice system. But the reality is, as long as you keep the same system in place that is built on and thrives on these historic oppressions, all you're doing is adding a new set of folks with a new pension into the same system, which is why we need to tackle this from not only a historic lens, but from a historic intersectional lens. And if we recognize and we educate ourselves and do more awareness around the different oppressions separately, then you can see how when it comes together, why we're getting the results we're getting, why Black girls are 3.5 times more, the rate is higher for incarceration, why we're seeing, in the sex trade, Black girls being treated differently than white girls who are doing the exact same thing. So we need to recognize this and the criminal justice system from an intersectional lens, and then recognize the gaps in how that system is playing on those intersectional approaches for the wrong reasons. Why we're seeing more Black and brown and indigenous folks being held at a certain standard that whites aren't. Why we have these racist police officers and racist judges that are holding these positions of power, and why we're not able to overthrow or overturn that, and why we're not in the positions of those authorities. So I think for starters, for anybody who has no knowledge of this system or any of that, I think that the first place that they need to start is looking at intersectional oppression.
Thank you. And I want to encourage any of our speakers, if you have anything to add, just feel free to jump in. This next question is for Cara and Melanie. Looking beyond police and the justice system, what are some of the other system failures or policy gaps that you think contribute to the continued subjugation and harm that girls of color face, including, gender expansive, non-binary, LGBTQ, young people of color?
I was gonna let Cara go first because I was just speaking, but I guess, outside of just what I mentioned about the police system, there's a lack of inclusion in all of these places. And I think that, again, in this current era where everybody wants to be progressive, we hear inclusion a lot or inclusive a lot, and everybody wants to be inclusive. But a lot of people, in my opinion, at these, and I'm speaking from foster care agencies, I'm speaking at, police departments, nonprofit organizations, what we're seeing is a lot of these performative types of inclusion where, you say that you want to expand your services to more marginalized groups of people outside of race. So you put she/her or your pronouns after your name, but in the reality, your work is not reflecting that you're trying to actually include more marginalized individuals in the people that you decide to serve. And I think that that's one of the biggest gaps that I see, because I think that even though we have a long way to go with the racial lens, I feel like, at least in my generation right now, there's a lot more talk about racial justice, and there's a lot more talk about how, 400 plus years of racial inequality, now that conversation is surfacing a lot more. But even with that, we're still seeing this lack of equality when it comes to gender inclusion. We're seeing this lack of equality when it comes to disabled individuals inclusion. Like, we're not seeing these other forms of marginalization in these services. So yeah, it's great if we have, you know, a part of a court system or a foster care agency that says we're going to take the extra step to talk about racial inequality. But again, if you're not looking at it from an intersectional perspective, you're still failing a Black individual who's Black and gay. You're still failing a Black individual who's Black and disabled. You're not looking at the other forms of oppression and the other things that make up the whole person. So in turn, you're failing many of the people that you serve, whether that be members, clients, constituents, on whatever level. So I think for me, one of the biggest gaps that I'm seeing is this lack of inclusion for other things outside of, you know, police inequality and race.
So in terms of gaps, it's definitely centerpiece, what Melanie just shared. For us, I think one of the biggest, I mean, for the people of color here in this session, how many of you have that auntie or uncle or sibling that just like chilled out with their parents until they were like 50, you know, like just lived there until they were 50 or whatever, until they got married or just, you know, that's normal, right? Like, but in this system that we're operating in professionally, you're 18, that you're an adult, right? Like, that's it. We don't care for you anymore. You will never be seen as a victim again. And, you know, you need to be seen as a victim in order to get all these supports, or some of these supports that are starting to be built. And so that's a huge problem, that cliff that people fall off. And some states, right, have expanded definitions and services up until 24, but it's such a fight. And it's like, it's really odd in Hawaii because we're a majority Asian and Native Hawaiian state. And you're arguing with people, you know, who have those values. Like, we don't see 18 as a cutoff, but then when we get into the policy world, it's like, we're gonna stick to this hard line, you know, American definition. So that's one of the biggest things, because there really is nothing. It's almost just this desert after 18 in Hawaii. Another thing is definitely for our trans and gender nonconforming youth and young adults, you know, the services there are really lacking as well. And we see this even into, you know, gender-based violence, systematic supports after that into adulthood. So there's a lot of fear and misunderstanding and animus as a result of that. I mean, you know, another thing is data. I hate to be one of those disaggregate the data people, but it's real. And I mean, up until a couple years ago, people said sex trafficking of children doesn't happen in Hawaii because there were only like 5 cases that had been counted or something like that. This is within the 2000s. Because for some reason in government, right, the absence of data means the absence of a problem, and it's so convenient and it's so illogical, but it really is a problem. So that's another thing that needs to be funded. And then, you know, we put all this funding, the limited funding that we have, into the emergency room, right? It's like an emergency room triage system, and we're not funding the actual people that we need, like community organizers, to build the infrastructure to redirect, you know, this ship. So if there's one thing I would say, it's really funding community organizers who can create the political will, because it is not there and the political cover is not there a lot of the time. So that's my feedback from Hawaii.
I just want to co-sign and underscore something, Cara, that you said, which, you know, Kim Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, said when she started to do more work specifically focused on Black girls, she said, we haven't even bothered enough to count. There has been, the underinvestment actually starts with the absence of data. And I have the great honor of working with Dr. Monique Morissette, who leads Grantmakers for Girls of Color, who's done a lot of research specifically on how Black girls are pushed out of schools. And part of the reason why we don't see we see significant policy gaps in addressing the abuse to prison pipeline is because there is an assumption that girls, in particular girls of color, because of the way that we are socially programmed and because survival requires us to be, we appear quote unquote fine. Part of that is because the unique ways that the abuse to prison pipeline is showing up for girls of color is different. The criminalization of girls and gender expansive youth looks slightly different than it does, and the approaches have to be different, to Melanie's point. So I just want to underscore what Kara is naming in terms of data not needing, the absence of data should not be a barrier, because part of the reason why there is no data is because of the lack of the intersectional frame. So it's not only fund the data collection, but don't predicate your giving and your strategy on data collection, because organizations, organizers, and communities have not been resourced to collect data in a way that meaningfully and authentically represents the truth of their experiences. They've often been the subjects of other people's studies. And so the data that does exist actually reinforces some of the systems of oppression that they're working to combat.
I want to actually highlight something.
Go ahead.
Sorry. No, I want to highlight something that both of them said just now, actually. Cara was so spot on when she talked about funding and when she talked about the age limit. Especially now with everybody talking about, you know, the police reform or police abolition, defunding the police, we're not putting all of this excess money into where it needs to go. And I think that contributes to our abuse to prison pipeline. You take all of the discretionary income that the government has and you put it into, quote unquote, bettering your police force. Yet, again, if you're not looking at it from an intersectional lens, the system isn't actually changing. So you're just funding more workers to work in the system, and not giving it into the communities where the resources actually lie, or to help them fund the resources that are actually needed. Therefore, more of us end up going back into the streets, back into criminal situations, back into all of these things that lead us in jail by the time we're 30. So I see a lot of the funding needing to be redirected to prevent some of these things from happening. As Cara mentioned, like 18, 21, that does not make you an adult. You can vote, but that's about all you can do. Other than that, you're not at your brain isn't even fully developed yet. So you're not at the place where you can live a sustainable life on your own. If you are, that lucky you, but that's not the majority. And the reality is, you tell somebody at 18 in some states, and here in New York now they pushed it to 21, at least in the foster care system, hey, you're 21, go about your way. By the time they're 24, they've already gotten back into some kind of issue that causes them to either get a running with the law, back in jail, or back in the court system of some sort. And what we see now, you know, that people kind of jump for joy when they see things like this, where they say, hey, the government just expanded services or just expanded this funding for you until you're 24, but 24 doesn't make you an adult either. So we see a lot of these you know, on talking about the topic of gaps in some of these services, we're not putting the money where it actually belongs, and we need to take some of the money out of that. We're also not taking into account that these are still predominantly children, even over 20, that we're speaking about. We're talking about individuals that don't have all of the tools and resources already as marginalized folks, let alone them turning 18 and still being marginalized and saying, figure it on out, in a world, in a country where the system is literally targeting you for your marginalization. And then something that Maheen had touched upon that I just wanted to highlight was the idea that your approach cannot be the same for everybody and everything. And I think that contributes to some of the gaps that we see. You know, granted, there are some things that are universal that all people should have access to, but then depending on your organization, your agency, your police department, whatever it is and whatever sector that you work in, we need to remember that not a curriculum-based anything may not work for all groups of people in all sectors of life in all places. Something in New York State may not work the same in Hawaii, like where Cara is, or in DC, right? We see these things differently based on the community and the needs of that community. And what I'm finding is that these individuals and these agencies are not tailoring their curriculum to fit their community, hence why we still see so many numbers going into jail. We still see so many people falling victims to substance abuse and all of these things, and why we still see our marginalized communities remaining marginalized. So I think we just have to keep that in mind when we're talking about gaps in services and what we need to do to rectify that.
I think that's like a perfect segue to my next question, which is, you know, moving towards solutions. Like, what are some of the promising approaches, and what are some of the recommendations that could help us dismantle this pipeline and provide some of those supports and even the protections, right? I think Kara talked about like the triage method, right? Like we are too often interacting and responding once the harm has been done, right? How do we actually keep communities safe, protect young women and girls of color, and also just allow them to live and be kids and be girls and live out their full potential without the threats of these kind of like startling rates of violence, exploitation, and abuse that they are so often subject to. So that's kind of for all of you, whoever wants to go first, to kind of tackle that. And maybe even some of the work that you're doing in your jurisdictions, any promising approaches or either legislative or, practically speaking, that you've been able to institute that have, actually helped address the problem or assuage some of these issues we're talking about.
I'm happy to jump in. I want to acknowledge something you said earlier about the commercial sex industry. We can't shy away from that if we really mean ending the abuse to prison pipeline. And I think something really remarkable is happening in Hawaii. There's a rising movement of Native Hawaiian and immigrant rooted women who are struggling against the tensions there, to propose something that's really comprehensive and that sees the commercial sex industry as an attack on community sovereignty over our bodies. So sees it as part of, the part of this whole carceral patriarchy, rather than, just a consensual thing out there in the industry, deregulate, we can unionize and do labor rights to get rid of the ferocious violence. They're not naive, they get it, that this is part of the conversation and not a niche issue. And so they proposed something called the Bodies Back policy model. I'm sure you've heard of the cry for land back. And in Hawaii, it's very important that Bodies Back is part of that movement. And so what it entails is really developing the demand for, we never talk about who really is causing all this, right? Yes, government plays a huge role, but also not all the violence just comes from government, but also from private industry and patriarchy. And so we don't want to give a free pass to that, even if we remove the state and state intervention, let's say that's the goal, to have, a capitalist market of sex will not and cannot restrain itself. And so, to be just left at the whim of that will not solve this problem. It will still lead to massive levels of violence. And so we find that the status quo is unbearable. It's not prohibition. That is a lie, right? It's this attack on particularly girls of color. It's never been about actually ending harm or even ruffling any men's feathers who are a part of this system, right? It's about protecting them. And so what we're proposing is basically demand prevention, a non-carceral abolition of the industry. I hear all the time people in our climate justice space saying, well, oil jobs are dangerous. We can and must do better. Well, jobs that relate to selling sexual consent are horribly dangerous, and we can and must do better for girls and trans and gender non-conforming youth. So that's kind of where we're coming from. I don't want to go too much into it. I can send information or link information, but it's called the Bodies Back movement. And it has a policy articulation already. And it's just, I think, where everything needs to go and where the movement will eventually lead.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's a really important point. I mean, one of the things that people fail to realize, and we're always trying to educate about, is that the sex trade is a key driver for criminalization, even when you decriminalize the act of selling sex. So we've realized that in the context of children. We partnered with a survivor named T. Ortiz to do this No Such Thing campaign to make clear there's no such thing as a child prostitute, that they're children, they can't consent. And we've been incredibly successful decriminalizing prostitution offenses for children in, upwards of, I think, 35 states at this point. And people really naively thought that would solve the problem. Like, we are checking the box, we are eliminating police contact with these girls who are overwhelmingly girls of color. And that's just not been the case. We are still seeing, because of all of the other harms and systemic issues these girls continue to get arrested for different things. And so I think, you have to go deeper than just a decriminalization or a deregulation, right? We have to really look towards envisioning and being aspirational in terms of what type of life and society we want for, our young women and girls. I also want to give a shout out to Kara. You're incredibly modest. Kara also helped lead one of actually the only state in the country who has passed legislation to clear the records of sex trade survivors. So adults with prostitution records, irrespective of whether they were trafficked or not, just recognizing that we don't punish people for acts of survival. And so I think that is, profoundly important. I know we are following your lead and trying to include that in our sealing and expungement efforts here in DC. Mel, do you want to go next? I know you're leading a lot of really fabulous work in New York City.
In my head, I'm like, do I want to go next? No, not really. I don't.
Gosh, I can take the alley-oop, Mel. I think the other things that I would emphasize about solutions, particularly around the sexual abuse of prison pipeline, is, and I would invite you, Yasmin, even though you're the moderator, to talk about some of the policy efforts that Rights for Girls has been involved in, including, for example, a lot of really major legislative victories at the federal level with respect to the reauthorization of the Juvenile Delinquency and Prevention Act. The first time the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act was passed, it had no contemplation of girls and gender expansive youth. And Rights for Girls and your work really was able to get language in that bill that didn't just contemplate girls and gender expansive youth, but actually talked about trauma and actually talked about the role of trauma and how a lack of an understanding of trauma and a lack of an understanding of adverse childhood experiences actually renders all young people more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. And it was actually by having, and this is why I talk about why we need the intersectional approach, because we had an intersectional frame, because you guys took a policy approach that contemplated girls and gender expansive youth, all young people are now going to get screened differently for trauma. And it allows for a much broader understanding of what it looks like. Similarly, I know that Rights for Girls has been doing a lot of training in the judicial system around what trauma-informed approaches to young people look like, knowing that the system still exists while folks are working to create different systems. So I would throw the question back to you a little bit to articulate some of those policy initiatives, including language that you've been able to get into the anti-trafficking legislation at the federal level. But the other thing I just want to throw out there is also, when we're talking about the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, we're not just talking about systems that address child sexual abuse like the child welfare system and systems that are related to the criminal legal system. We're also talking about housing. We're also talking about the medical system and the behavioral health systems, because these are the systems that actually surround the experiences, particularly of women and girls and gender expansive youth, especially when they become parents. And I think that without that framework, there's an amazing organization out of California called the Young Women's Freedom Center that is organizing. And when they talk about women and girls incarceration, the first system they talk about is housing. And when we think about domestic violence and gender-based violence, we have to think about housing and access to safe and accessible and affordable housing as part of that conversation. So I would just uplift those strategies in addition to the other strategies that we're talking about, and emphasize, like, the beauty of an intersectional frame is actually that you get to take a comprehensive and coherent approach to all of the different systems that's rooted in the baseline of human rights and values. But I would actually love for you to answer some of these questions around the work that you all have been doing to infuse this analysis in policy.
Thank you. That's really kind, Maheen. She was an all-star Rights for Girls alum. But yeah, I mean, we do a lot of work at the federal level, and again, always centering the voices and experiences of girls of color, and to the extent possible, having girls be there to advocate for themselves and their peers and their communities about what it is that they need and what it is that they expect and deserve, right, from the lawmakers, the policymakers, and the advocates who are working with and for them. And so we've been able to get really important language into legislation like the JJDPA, which is, this landmark federal law that governs minimum standards for how states respond to juvenile justice. So making sure that there are specialized state representatives who understand sexual abuse and trauma, screening youth upon intake for things like sex and labor trafficking, diverting them out of the system into support services, collecting data on pregnant and parenting youth. I mean, the fact that that's completely lacking. We have worked with so many girls who were pregnant or parenting while behind bars and received no prenatal care, no just harmful, degrading conditions of confinement, restraints, belly chains, ankle chains, use of restraints during pregnancy and delivery. Girls who were 6 months pregnant in places like Fulton County, Georgia, who were, handcuffed behind the back while pregnant. So just very dehumanizing. And often when I share these scenarios, people are like, oh, what country are you talking about? And I have to say things like Tennessee, this is happening all over the country. And so we've been very intentional about trying to incorporate those different provisions, but it all comes directly from listening and working with girls themselves. Mel, do you want to add anything? You absolutely don't have to. And I'm happy to tout your work and your brilliance.
I'm okay. But I think that, everything collectively, everything that you guys just said, with an emphasis on Maheen talking about some of the other resources that we need to focus on, and going back to this notion of intersectionality, I think once you focus on, at least let's say for the sake of my example, in a sex trafficking world, when you talk about survivors, sometimes we focus on the problem itself, i.e. being the sex buyers, the system of prostitution, without focusing on what are the oppressions that got us there in the first place, that made us susceptible to such a crime, to such abuse, and also without focusing on what resources are needed so that we could, for lack of a better word here, rehabilitate the person that went through such experience and such abuse. So I think that if you're looking at things intersectionally, you can see how one oppression connects to another and how they all create this third oppression, or how it leads somebody to somewhere else. I think we need to look at this lens all the way from, some people say a bottom-up approach, some people say a top-down approach. I say focus on all of it, it's all necessary, but looking at it from a federal level and figuring out what kind of policies either that we have that we can improve, or some that we can instill, that focus on tackling all forms of these types of oppressions, not specifically racial justice, but looking at racial justice as it pertains to gender, ageism, ableism, classism, substance abuse, whatever have you, and also looking at it from a more based level and trying to analyze what is it that we need so that we can, we can't eradicate the oppression in a day, but what is it that we need so that we don't have more people from these marginalized communities being re-exploited or re-susceptible to poverty, or not being able to make it out and just remaining in that system. So to me, it all starts with just looking at all forms of intersectionality and seeing how all oppressions connect with one another, and how that propels somebody into further oppression and marginalization.
Thank you so much. And then we're going to do one more question before shifting to some of the audience questions. And so this last one's for you, Kara. You recently helped craft the first explicitly feminist COVID economic recovery plan, and it's since been lifted up and emulated, I know, by a bunch of other countries and nations. And we've talked a lot today about the United States. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about this issue globally, and how do the experiences of girls and young women of color here either mirror or completely differ from that of girls in other countries?
Thank you. Yeah, we mean business in Hawaii. We're about it. So, I mean, the things, right? Like, just as a side note, people say, and there's this argument that we can't end this until we end capitalism, or until we end all vulnerabilities. Imagine making the argument that we're just going to settle for repetitive rape of girls and all our youth until we end all vulnerabilities. That makes no sense. It doesn't need to be happening. But at the same time, we put forward these comprehensive positive visions, because we need to also do the harm reduction and transition to a better economic system. So yeah, we put out, it's our year anniversary. We put out a feminist economic recovery blueprint for the state. It was the first from a government. And you know, I think it resonated so much globally because, you know, patriarchy is globalized, and the Western gender hierarchy through colonization took root in so many places by force, and now it is a defining feature in many countries. And you know, there's still this until recently, even in the United States, right? Women were legally defined as property too. So there is a lot of work to be done everywhere. I think that you know, the United States is not a leader on human rights. Shout out to other countries. Because, like, I mean, we consistently do not rank in like the top 10 or anything like that. I mean, countries like Rwanda, the Philippines, Namibia, Nicaragua are better in terms of their policy framework. Now, do they have the resources and the pathway to implement a lot of that? You know, not necessarily, but you know, I think during COVID, I'm sure all of you have heard about the disproportionate job losses to women, the massive rise in gender-based violence because of people taking out their anxieties and their frustration and even self-loathing from masculinity during these crises onto girls and women and children. So all of these things are appearing in other countries, and the infrastructure there has not been built. So I think that our feminist economic recovery, if you want to check it out, it's relevant wherever you're from. And yeah, we've been helping a lot of countries, you know, dialogue on how it started, our origin story, and how we're getting it off the ground. So thanks for asking and uplifting that, Yasmin.
Can I also just add a couple more things? Because I think Cara lifted up something, and I think Cara is so emblematic of and referenced being an organizer, being someone who comes from community and who has deep relationships, and working with organizers to advance an intersectional feminist analysis into policy. And when you look around the world, there is actually really beautiful, most of the feminist movements around the world are led by women who come from either women who are indigenous, women who come from quote unquote lower castes, women who are of the Black or African diaspora, and so diaspora or were enslaved and are descendants of enslaved peoples. So I think it is important when we're talking about this in the broader context and in the US, the similarity I would say is actually all of the people who are leading justice-related movements, whether it is racial justice or gender justice or economic justice, tend to be people who live at the intersections of these identities because survival requires it, and to Cara's point, because people jump back into really ancestral wisdom about what our communities have always needed and what power should actually look like in our communities, which is really like what any fight for justice is. So I want to both honor and applaud the work that you are leading in Hawaii, and also just name that your experiences and the experiences of women and girls in Hawaii are exactly why I think it's not an accident that this feminist economic recovery plan came out of Hawaii. And I think the similarities between the experiences of colonized people in Hawaii and the experiences of colonized people around the world are really important to emphasize.
That's super helpful. And thank you guys so much for all of your wisdom and your time and your energy. I'm going to shift to a few questions that came in from the audience. So let's see. How do the panelists think of the relationship between racial and gender justice in the broader global context? I guess we just kind of talked about that. Let's see, sorry. As someone in the media, we are working to lift up trauma-informed policy around healing and alternatives to incarceration. Given the need to adjust based on locality, can you point to some good practices being used in certain communities? I can start on that, and people can jump in. I mean, this is something that we are constantly pushing for when it comes to children, right? That there is just an over-reliance on the legal system and the criminal justice system when it comes to, the just everyday experiences of adolescence when it comes to youth. This is kind of what I was alluding to in the earlier part of the presentation, where we are seeing an over-policing of youth of color, especially Black girls, who are subject to, lots of racial and gender biases through, there was a great report by Georgetown Law Center and Jamila Blake and Rebecca Epstein that talked about this concept as adultification, that Black girls are perceived as less innocent, more knowledgeable about sex, promiscuous, right? And as a result, it impacts the ways in which adults and systems interact with them. And so we routinely see the over-policing of normal adolescent behaviors, which land girls in trouble, school suspensions, and ultimately in the justice system. But then we see this incredible underprotection when girls experience violence at these astronomical rates. Like we talked about, 60% of Black girls experience sexual abuse before 18. Native women and girls experience astronomical rates of violence, and usually at the hands of a non-Native person. And then there's no accountability. So I think, we have to be very nuanced in our responses to questions like these, because alternatives to incarceration and just being mindful of the types of responses we need to hold that our system reacts to different groups of people very distinctly, and that some people are afforded certain protections and are deemed, worthy and valuable and therefore entitled to safety and protection, whereas others are not and are discarded. So I think that's just an important nuance to hold when we are, thinking about policies like that. Does anyone else want to add?
I mean, I would like add a little color to what you were offering in terms of exactly what you named. There's a school in Oakland, California called Emerge, which was created to really interrupt what folks and Dr. Monique Morris articulates as the confinement to college pathways that could exist, actually. Like that there is actually another side to the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, which is how do you take the innate resilience and strength of, we heard Cara and Melanie, when they introduced themselves, talk about how their lived experiences are actually what make them, in addition to all of the incredible work that they've been doing, give them a particular wisdom. And so like the question is looking at strategies that take that wisdom and transfer it to be able to access the excellence that is in girls and gender expansive youth of color. And I use that particular school because it's specifically for young people, for girls who have experienced juvenile justice, the juvenile justice system, and or have experienced push out or have been pushed out of school due to particular policies and practices and biases that they've experienced. And what strategies like that do is it's not necessarily, I think it's a beautiful alternative to incarceration, is really give young people safe places to be. When you see young people running away, ask them what they're running from or what they're running to. And I think we see that. The other thing is, Cara said this at the beginning, invest in community organizers, because and not in a way that absolves systems of what they need to do. Actually, community organizers are demanding that systems either respond or be abolished and recreated to respond to communities in the ways that make sense. And so I think it is about, for the funders that are listening, about investing in those long-term strategies and allowing for imagination and allowing for what doesn't already, what communities know already existed, but investing in the things that are already rooted in communities, while also strengthening how systems can actually place accountability where it needs to be placed and not on the bodies of these girls and their communities.
You. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I'm trying to find stuff that we haven't necessarily touched on. Here's one. Could you speak to the intersections of substance abuse, racial justice, and gender justice?
Research on this, so maybe I can take a stab. We did a survey through the state's largest nonprofit service provider and identified around 100 people who met the criteria for sex trafficking, and 27% reported that they had first been coerced into exchanging sex for drugs. So, and 44% stated that they had struggled with addiction, prior to or during that experience. And we know that the first drug use happens really young with our sex trafficked youth. And usually, right, it's just a way to cope with unbearable violence in their lives. And so there is a very strong overlay between between criminalization, right? Because like Yasmin noted, even we have to decriminalize those who are being exploited, period, immediately. That's without question. But it still doesn't reduce police involvement because we see such high levels of drug use among people who are coping with all of this, and so, or being forced to do that as a control mechanism. So yeah, I think that it's really important, and it's a centerpiece of how we're struggling with this, especially because in Hawaii we don't have treatment for youth, and so we send them to the continental United States, children without their families, to another continent. It's unbelievable. So it's a big part of this story. Thank you for bringing that up.
And I'll just add one point, kind of tying it back to the missing and murdered Indigenous women. I mean, we do these judicial trainings, as Maheen said, and we do a lot of kind of technical assistance. And, when we talk about things like trauma, we expand it to, talk about the gendered nature of trauma, right? One of the things that Dr. Stephanie Covington talks about is, when men and male identifying people experience trauma, it's often more indiscriminate. But when women and female identifying people experience trauma and violence, it's most often at the hands of somebody they know, and often who tells them I love you. And so they manifest and respond to trauma differently. And so we also talk about historical and intergenerational trauma, and I think that's particularly important when we look at Indigenous and Black populations in the United States, and the ways in which that is carried down. Epigenetics, I think, is very real. And so substance abuse is a very, common coping mechanism, particularly among Indigenous women and girls here in the United States and elsewhere, who, many of whom, the majority of whom, have suffered sexual abuse and violence, many of whom have experienced life in the sex trade. And so, I think when you talk about those intersections of gender justice, racial justice, and substance abuse, it is just too common a narrative that I think all of us see and hear in the women and girls that we have worked with and that we know, personally. So I think that's a really great question, and I thank you for raising it. So we're winding down. We have just a couple more minutes. I just want to give our panelists an opportunity for any closing thoughts before we say goodbye to our participants, who have just been really, really wonderful. And thank you for enriching our conversation with your questions. Any final thoughts?
Sorry, just a plug to funders to really consider, across your grant making, how you are thinking intersectionally to supporting organizations like Rights for Girls and the community organizations that Cara was lifting up, the organizations that Melanie is working with and on behalf of. It is really critical. There is a vast underinvestment, both here in the United States and across the globe, particularly in the global South, of feminist organizing, particularly organizations that are led by Black, Indigenous, and other women of color. So I would leave folks with that.
I would add, just check how you're viewing intersectionality, and check how the things that you're involved in, services, organizations, agencies, see how, and if at all, if there's an intersectional lens on how you serve your youth, how you serve your members, your constituents, or ask yourself when you come across somebody, if you're not in those sectors, ask yourself when you meet somebody who's marginalized or who has any kind of experience with the court system at all, what are the intersectional oppressions that got them there, and how can we rectify those things so they don't come back?
30 seconds. Fund a hopeful politics. You know, when I hear sex work is work, when so many women hear that, it triggers cognitive dissonance because it keeps us in this same carceral system. It is not the answer, and it's not what is coming out of our communities. We are demanding something better, and it's time to fund the bold and the brave. And so, you know, if you're going to fund those organizers, seek out the ones who are truly at the margins, who are leading this ideological and practical and life or death fight, because it really is, you know, it's not, those seeds are never in full bloom, right? You have to really nurture them. And that's where we need to, I think, focus our support and where I'm directing resources. So thank you so much for attending, everybody. And yeah, aloha.
Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. Like, may we be so aspirational to envision a world where all of us can be safe and free to actually live out our best lives. So thank you so much for all of your work. We are so, so grateful for you sharing all of your insights. And thank you to our participants. Take care, everyone.